Hey gang, welcome back to another video. Now back in 2019, I made this 3D printed Haunted Mansion door knocker replica. And I thought it looked pretty great, until about a month later when an original park-used version went up for auction and showed me just how inaccurate it really was. So now that I've got better reference materials and about 6 more years of experience under my belt, I thought it would be fun to tackle this project again, but this time using materials you'd find at a craft store. So let's get into it. One of the biggest changes since making my first version of the door knocker was the 2019 auction of a 1970s-era park-used prop. The listing included 4 high-resolution images, as well as dimensions to work off of, and I immediately saw the many ways that my first attempt at this prop was wrong. Rather than fix my version, I thought it would be fun to scratch build this with some odds and ends I had on hand, plus a few inexpensive items from the craft store, and hopefully I'll create a version that's a bit more accurate without any specialized tools. The first item I needed for the build was a 2.5-inch clear plastic Christmas ornament. This would act as the base for the spiked ball, but it's going to need some modifications, starting with losing the hanger. While this is the right size, the plastic from this ornament isn't particularly thick, so I figured I could backfill it with a bit of 2-part resin, which should give it some added thickness and would prevent it from accidentally being crushed at any point during the build. I started by adding a bit of tint to my cup to give the cured plastic a darker tone, and then I'm eyeballing the amounts of resin. I knew I wouldn't need much, so there's maybe 2 to 4 tablespoons of total resin, which will be plenty to coat the inside of the ornament. Once everything was mixed, I poured the resin into the sphere and started moving it around, making sure to coat the entire thing. A word of note with this method: if you add too much resin, the exothermic reaction may cause the plastic ornament to melt. So if you want thick walls, you're better off doing it in multiple layers rather than all at once. A few minutes later, once the resin is cured and cooled, it was time to remove the neck from the ornament. So I dragged out my sander and got to it. This takes a little time to do, since the plastic tends to melt and bind up, but stopping every minute or so to remove any plastic buildup will get you to a flat surface in no time. This could probably be done with a palm sander, although the sanding disc really helped to make sure that the surface was perfectly flat, which is a must since it will eventually be resting against the backing plate. With that out of the way, I needed to make some spikes, so I placed a dowel into my drill and sanded it into 3/8 of an inch points. Then I could use a hacksaw to cut each one off of the dowel rod, and then I had my studs. The next part of the build to tackle are the hinges. I found these 3/4-inch wooden beads at the craft store, and while they were the right size, they needed to be drilled out to fit some of the dowel rod. Thankfully, my step-up bits made quick time of this modification. The hole in the bead goes all the way through, but the enlargement is only about 1/4 inch deep, which should be just enough room to glue the dowel in place. While the glue sets up, I can start on the vertical bar. I'll be using the same dowel, but I want to remove some of the material from the end so that the join between the vertical and horizontal pieces looks a bit tidier. So I grabbed my rotary tool with a small sanding drum and started to sand in a notch. The drum isn't quite the same diameter as the dowel, so I had to rock it back and forth to get the right shape, but by creeping up on it, I was able to get a serviceable shape that should fit together nicely with the help of some glue. Now on to the most involved part of this build, the backing plate, which I created a template for so that I could cut it from 2 1/8-inch pieces of MDF. This could also be done with layers of craft foam, styrene, PVC board, or any other material that could be cut with a razor blade, a jigsaw, or a scroll saw. And speaking of which, if you want to tackle this build for yourself, I've included a link to my template in the video description for free. With my 2 layers cut out, I could fix one of the biggest mistakes from my original version: the small hammered indentations in the backing plate. But before I can get to adding that detail, I'll use the top layer to trace out where the indents will need to go, and then with a small engraving bit and my rotary tool, I can get to adding in those tiny hammered details. Once I'd sufficiently dotted the backing plate, I could glue the 2 layers together with some CA glue, and then get to gluing the remaining parts. Okay, looks like I did not press record. But fear not. I basically glued the horizontal and vertical pieces together, and then I set the ornament flat on the base and marked off where the dowel made contact. Then that got glued in place to hold its position before I applied additional layers of CA glue to build up around that joint. I also used some sandpaper to shave down the dowels and get them looking more like the photos. With that out of the way, I can move on to attaching the studs. I used the seam on the ornament to help with the center stud placement, and the rest were set as seen in the auction images. And while I know the placement isn't exact, more often than not I'm going for what feels right when I look at it, and that's exactly what I did here. With all the parts assembled, I can move on to paint. Like I do with any MDF-based project, I started with a clear coat to help seal the surface of the wood. This will keep it from soaking in any additional paint layers and helps to ensure a more uniform surface. When the clear coat was dry, I switched to a black filler primer to help smooth out any sanding marks and could set them aside to dry. The first bit of color I'll add to this piece is a bit of brown. This got applied in a random pattern since I still want some of the black to show through. This will help to make our gold layer look more gold. Then it was time for a bit of antique gold rub and buff applied with a nylon brush. I'm trying to get another random smattering of color to accentuate the tonality of the piece, since I'm shooting for something that looks like it's been handled over decades. So there should be oil from people's hands and environmental aging as well that would cause the shiny metal finish to oxidize. And when I think I've got the right amount of gold, I can set it aside and start on the knocker. The last bit of paint will be to add a patina. In my other videos, I've done this with a spray bottle full of thinned acrylic paint. But for this piece, I'll be applying it in a few layers with a brush, starting with a really punchy teal color. For this finish, I wanted to build up to my final color. So I'll start with my darkest and most saturated color first, and blot it away with a paper towel. It may look like I'm removing all of the paint that I'm applying, but because this color is so strong, even a hint of it will start to cool down the very warm tones I've already created. And adding more will give it more depth, as each application varies from one to the next, as does the blotting with the paper towel. When I've worked the teal paint enough for the look I'm after, I add a lighter blue-green to the teal paint and start the process all over again, occasionally giving the paint a spritz of water from my tiny spray bottle to help it spread out and give me a bit more working time. This kind of buildup of undertones will give you the most interesting finish, so it's worth taking your time, even if it seems like a waste of materials. Now before you say it, I know that these colors don't match the auction photos, which is much more intensely green colored, but that was a conscious choice on my part. Since everything inside the Haunted Mansion is painted to be seen in low light, it reads a bit heavy-handed in other environments, so this patina is a bit more idealized for everyday viewing. Once everything had a chance to dry, I could get to gluing it all together. And when the glue was set, I applied a satin clear coat to lock in all of my weathering, but also to bring back a bit of the shine to the gold rub and buff. And here they are side by side. As you can see, my first paint job was very subdued and has very little character. You could argue that it doesn't really look like I did much aging at all, whereas the new version is much more interesting and looks a lot closer to the auction photo than my original. In fact, let's look at all three side by side. The scratch-built version has more of the hallmarks of the ride-used prop, and the patina definitely looks more in line with the photos. Thankfully, this technique isn't too time-consuming, and I can fix my old version to make it look more like the new one. But overall, I think this is a definite upgrade from when I first attempted this prop 6 years ago. Now, while this version is still a bit inaccurate, it's a great way to show my progress as a prop maker while building something from my favorite ride. And if you happen to have a project like this, I highly recommend revisiting it, because I think you'd be surprised by the outcome. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.